we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out, especially on a Monday night. I really appreciate it. We're having very exciting nights, a great topic, and an awesome speaker. So first off, just going to give a little bit of a rundown on how tonight's talk is going to work. We're going to start off with our guest speaker, who's going to present his position in a 30-minute argument. And then after that, we're going to open it up to a brief 10-minute question-and-answer period. We'll then proceed with a 20-minute discussion led by you guys. It's open to whatever opinions you guys have, regardless of what your political affiliation may be. So we just really want this to be a space for everyone to share their political opinion, irregardless of where it comes from. And finally, we'll conclude with a vote on whether or not we agree or disagree with the position of tonight's speaker. And we'll try to be done around 8 o'clock p.m. I don't want to hold you guys here too long. So a few things. When we are doing our discussion, we just ask that everyone remain being professional, makes their opinion in an academic setting, but most importantly, be respectful, especially in today's current political climate. It's important for us to have a respectful sharing of opinions. So, are there any questions before we get started? No? All right, great. So, with that said, today's topic is, should Cornell University make a stronger commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by 2035? In an interview with Cornell Daily Sun, President Garrett said that she thinks this is not a priority for the university. She stated, quote, "For me, the more important thing is the research and creative work and education that goes on, and not thinking about some arbitrary year dates that we really haven't studied with respect with how feasible it is for us to reach that." End quote. Tonight's guest speaker will be arguing against her position. He is a professor from the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Most of you probably already know him from his very popular course, Oceanography. I took it and I would highly recommend it. His research involves the use of satellite remote sensing methods to study environmental controls of ocean climate reduction at global scales. And in addition, he currently serves as a member of NASA's Ocean Biology and Biochemistry Science team. So that is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Monger.
Well, guys, thanks for coming out again on a Monday, a cold Monday. And how many people did take the oceanography class that I see? So there'll be a lot of numbers that come up here that you've seen before, but the way I want to lay out the talk tonight, and I have 25 slides, something like that, so I think I can keep it under the half-an-hour limit that I was allotted. So I want to talk a little bit about, just a few slides about kind of the state of knowledge of the science of climate change. Global warming, talk a little bit about global warming and some of the sort of the numbers associated with global warming. And then I want to talk a little bit about sea level rise, ocean acidification. There are a lot of other implications and ramifications of climate change that I don't have time to talk about tonight. Food security, national security, and extreme weather, all of these things are equally sort of scary, I would say, as sea level rise and ocean acidification are. But I know oceanography better than I know the other items, and I don't have so much time, so we'll skip those. But keep those in the back of your mind that it's not just about the ocean when we're talking about climate change. I want to make a few comments about the Paris climate talks. Leading up to them, I claim that they could potentially be the most important gathering of people in all of human history. It's really this moment of make or break for whether or not humanity is able to survive or not survive the coming centuries. And they've made some really important consensus statements and some consensus points that I want to bring up, including that we need to be carbon neutral by 2035. And then I want to bring up a little bit of background about Cornell's Climate Action Plan, what it entails. And I'll focus a little bit on deep geothermal heat energy, because that's a critical component of the action plan to get us to 2035. It's also the one that's kind of the most expensive component of all the components. And it involves a lot of uncertainty on whether we can accomplish this or not. It's a pretty bold feat. People liken it to the moon shot, when we proposed to go to the moon. And then I'll make a few comments about why I think we need to have a hard deadline for 2035, and it connects back to the consensus of all nations on Earth that say we need to do this. And it also comes back to what the consequences are with business as usual, with regard to warming and sea level rise and acidification. And then I'll talk a little bit about the need for courageous leadership at this point in time, at this point in history. So there we go. So some background for those who didn't take my class. Concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up by 40%. By the way, about 8 years ago when I first started teaching oceanography, it was 30%, and now it's at 40%. So the CO2 concentrations are increasing rapidly. Twice, half of all the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, we put in the atmosphere since 1980. So it's not a slow, steady process. It's a rapidly accelerating process. I have a couple of important points right here. The first one is that CO2 increases by 2 to 3 parts per million every year. Several years ago when I started teaching the oceanography class, the number was at 375s, and now it's at 400. So it's made those dramatic changes just in the 8 years, 7 years that I've been teaching the class. And the point here is that in 20 more years, it'll be at 450. 450 is considered the point at which we're probably going to cross. It could come before that, but earlier than that. But generally agreed upon, 450 parts per million is when we cross over that 2-degree warming that everybody thinks we shouldn't cross. And then a really important point for me anyhow is this idea that what we put in the atmosphere today stays in the atmosphere for 10,000 years. So what we do today is going to affect people generations from now for 10,000 years. Incidentally, all of written human history is only 5,000 years old. So this, for all intents and purposes, all of the remainder of humanity is at stake, not just this generation, but generations for 10,000 years. As a result of the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, global average temperatures have risen since the industrial era by 0.85 degrees. We actually crossed it this year into a 1-degree rise. It spiked up 1 degree because of the extreme El Nino we had. But the multi-decadal trend, that is the signal of global warming, has increased by 0.85 degrees. 2 important points here. 2 degrees, how many people, everybody's heard the number 2 is probably the most important number of your lifetime, I would say. 2 degrees C is the internationally accepted limit or threshold that we should not cross to keep human civilization and human societies stabilized. And it may seem like 2 degrees is a small number, and it may seem trivial, and it may seem like I'm making a big deal out of a pretty small number. And so I always like to bring it back to this idea that the last time we had an ice age 15,000 years ago, it was just 4 degrees colder, and we had 2 miles of ice on top of Ithaca, New York. So 4 degrees colder is dramatic. You know, it's 2 miles of ice on top of our head. So 4 degrees warmer, I can't describe it. I don't really have the sort of the image in my head. But as dramatic as 4 degrees colder would be with an ice age and 2 kilometers of ice, we're going to have something that dramatic with 4. And 2, so we don't want to go 4 above. That would be really a big deal. 2 above is not going to be great. We're at 0.85, and we have droughts, we have wildfires, we have floods, we have all kinds of issues with 0.85 degrees. So 2 is not going to be fun. I promise you guys, it's not going to be fun. But a lot of people think it's like just about as far as we want to get and still be safe. And I'll show you later that there's actually an aspiration. One of the outcomes of the Paris talks was, all the nations on Earth said we would love to keep it at 1.5 if we could. It's really, really hard. So 2 is not going to be great, but we don't want to get over that 2-degree limit if we can help it. So there's consensus. Numerical models have been run over and over and over again. The dark line is, the black line is the observed warming. The red line is models when you add anthropogenic greenhouse gases, anthropogenic forcing. The blue flat line essentially is when you don't add anthropogenic forcings to the model. And I always bring around this idea that when I was a grad student, we'd be doing experiments in the lab, and if we had this idea, we thought we knew how it worked, we'd run the experiment, and like it worked, it worked. And the joke in the lab was you never wanted to repeat it, right? Because you got it to work, and you don't want to take the chance that it's not going to really work the second time. So somebody didn't run one of these models one time and go, oh, it worked, it's human caused, and then just walk away from it. People in Japan, people in China, people in the US, Germany, England, they all have their models, and all of them, every time they add the CO2, we get the observed warming, and we don't add the CO2, we get a flat line. So it's like running this experiment over and over and over again, and every time we do it, we get that if we don't add the CO2, we don't get the warming. If we add the CO2, we get the warming. And it's that sort of thing, multiple ways of looking at this numerically, these models, that has brought us to this point where nobody argues, even the most extreme skeptic doesn't argue anymore, that we've warmed, the planet has warmed since the industrial era. And scientists are now 95% certain that it's largely human caused. And if you're a scientist, 95% is the gold standard. Like I publish all the time with like 65 or 75% certainty. 95, it's like you're done, completely done. And I add this anecdotal comment that we're now more certain of human-caused climate change than we are that smoking causes cancer. I would go one further and say this, that I don't know if you know this, but every National Academy of Science, so the National Academy of Science, every nation has one, they're the best. I'll never be a National Academy member. I wish I could be, but I won't be. But they are like the brightest of the bright, Nobel laureates and such like that. Every National Academy of Science of every nation on Earth, 100%, have written letters and signed letters stating that humans are largely responsible for the observed global warming. So the science is absolutely positively done. There's not even an inkling of room really to argue. I mean, climate skepticism or science skepticism in general is good, but it's a really overwhelming amount of consensus here on human cause. So the science is really basically in now. I want to make one point here, last one on the science, to really hit home what's happening here. So this is 800,000 years of carbon dioxide, and we've gone up and had interglacial, we've gone down and had an ice age. Up, interglacial, down, glacial, up, down, right? And it's done this for 800,000 years on its own. And we know the timing of these ups and downs are timed with the variations in orbital forcing, called Milankovitch forcing. And the best the orbital forcing could do, the best the natural processes could do. And we kind of think that a lot of the CO2 that rises up in the atmosphere is being drawn out of the ocean and then drawn back down into the ocean, because the deep ocean has 40 times more carbon dioxide in the deep ocean than the atmosphere. So my point here is the best that natural forces could do for 800,000 years was squeeze out a little bit of carbon dioxide out of the ocean, put it into the atmosphere, rise it up to 280 parts per million, and then later on drop back down to 180. So 180, 280, 180, 280. You need to be down at 180 to have an ice age. And the point I want to make, the whole reason for this slide is this comment right now, which is reading James Hansen's book on climate forcings. He made this offhand statement that just really has stayed with me. And he said, as long as there's a functioning human society on this earth, we will never, ever have another ice age. And the point is this, that we can't have an ice age unless we get CO2 down to 180. And we're at 400, and it's not going to go below, unless we learn how to extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and inject it into deep. We will never have another ice age. In fact, there was just a paper that came out that said, had we not come along and pulled all this carbon out of the ground and lit it on fire for our energy, really, this is the point I want to make. I don't have a slide for it, but when I try to tell people, like, we don't have to run away from something bad, we can run towards something awesome. And what we have right now is crap as far as fossil carbon energy goes. I mean, we are literally digging, 50 years from now, we're going to look back and people are going to go, you've got to be kidding me. It's like, you dug stuff out of the ground and lit it on fire for your energy? And that's what you did? We're one step above burning logs, So, and we suffer for it. Our oceans get oil pollution, trains catch on fire and burn people to death, and people choke on air pollution and die by the millions. We put up with this crappy form of energy when we could have, renewable energy that's way better than what we have. So, anyway, back to this thing. I always get so sidetracked. Anyway, so we are more powerful than the forces that create ice ages. We're more powerful, humans are more powerful than orbital forcing. And I'll add one more thing. I've been giving this in my class for many years now, and it's been kind of, sort of generally rumbled upon agreement by biologists that we are in a sixth mass extinction, that the rate of species loss. A paper just came out last year that really put the numbers on very solidly and published in peer-reviewed literature that show that the rate of species loss now equals the rate of species loss after the asteroid hit the Earth and took out all the dinosaurs and everything else. And that's due to climate change, but it's also due to land use changes and all sorts of things, paving things over, turning croplands from that were diverse into monoculture. So we are now, as humans, we're as powerful as the forces that create ice ages, and we're as powerful as an asteroid hitting the Earth. We have grown in abundance. The human population has grown so large, and our technology is so great that we're bigger than an asteroid, we're bigger than an ice age. And we need now to get smart on how we deal with ourselves in this world. It used to be when we didn't have many people on the planet, we could be cavalier and do whatever we wanted and it wouldn't be a big deal. But now we've gotten so big that we have to start getting smart and being really careful about how we are in the world. Okay, so a few things on some of the consequences of this rising CO2, rising temperature. Sea level rise is one of them. It's expected by the end of the century to be a meter above pre-industrial, and that actually gets revised. 7 years ago, scientists thought that it could only be 40 centimeter rise. Now they're like, we think it's a meter, and there are already papers coming out going, you know what, I think it's going to be faster than that. I think it's going to be more than a meter. But presently, the last IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it came out about close to 2 years ago now. Report 5, they come out about every 5 years, pegs it at 1 meter. This is a global average sea level rise. And oh, by the way, I'll just go back and say it's accelerating. This is sort of linear through the early parts of the industrial period, and the latter parts, the accelerating rise of sea level. This is a map of sea level rise directly measured over the last almost 20 years from satellites. The oranges are a positive rise in sea level, and the blues are actually a drop in sea level. And the point is that sea level doesn't rise evenly everywhere. It rises faster in some places than others. And in the United States, on the East Coast, it's rising. On the West Coast, it's actually, most of it's falling a little bit. That won't always fall, right? We'll eventually add enough carbon and heat the ocean enough and melt enough glacier that it will rise as well. But it's unequal rising. In the U.S., vulnerable locations, cities, New Orleans, Miami, Jacksonville, Norfolk, Virginia, and the large naval base. There's the largest naval base on the planet. Is vulnerable, and Lower Manhattan, it's not on this map, but Lower Manhattan, we all know, is vulnerable after Superstorm Sandy. I've added this in at the last minute. I hope it doesn't throw me over time, but I just had to make this comment because it's so powerful. There was a guy that came, this was printed in the Wall Street Journal 3 years before Superstorm Sandy came ashore, and this guy came and talked to my department, Earth and Atmospheric Science, and Mayor Bloomberg had asked to do a study to be commissioned for him to assess what would be the consequences of 1 meter rise in sea level for New York City at the end of the century. He came back with this study and he presented it to us in my department, and he said this one meter by itself won't be the big problem, but 1 meter with the storm surge is going to flood the subways, it's going to do all this stuff that Superstorm Sandy exactly did. So this is a man that's smart. He predicted the consequences of Sandy for New York City. So I want to set that up, and then a couple of years later, Bloomberg said, okay, what should we do? And there was another study, and there were several authors. Some authors said we need to build seawalls, and his recommendation was move New York City. I'm serious. These are the things I listen to in my department sometimes, and I feel like I'm watching a science fiction movie or something. He followed up with this, and he said, listen, it took 100 years to build Lower Manhattan from the early 1900s till today. We stopped zoning large buildings down there, and over a 100-year period, all the new buildings have to be built high up on a higher ground, and we eventually, over a 100-year period, transition lower parts of Manhattan anyhow into park space that we allow to periodically flood. That's the most sort of tame way to deal with this problem. But those are the kinds of thinkings we have to do now, and this is at the end of the century. You guys are probably going to be alive then. Your kids definitely will be alive then. And so this is a big deal. This is a global perspective. These are, I can't read all these large cities here, but we've got Calcutta, Mumbai, Shanghai, Miami, all of these cities with millions of people being affected by 1 meter rise at the end of the century. Also, these are in billions of dollars, so these are thousands of billions of dollars, so these are trillions of dollars. So these are trillions of dollars in assets that are vulnerable to 1 meter sea level rise at the end of the century. The point is, doing nothing is a bad idea, guys. You think it's going to be too expensive now, we are going to just be paying like hell out of this. So anyway, it's a big deal with lots of people and lots of assets vulnerable to this. And this is with business as usual. If we don't get our act together and tone down and draw our carbon dioxide down to zero, essentially our emissions. Acidification, The ocean's taken up about a third of everything that we burned, all the CO2 we put in the atmosphere, the ocean's taken up about a third, so you can thank the ocean for that. But that's come at a cost. The ocean's acidity has increased by 26%. And we now have, CO2 is, absorbs much more easy in cold water than warm water, so polar seas are particularly vulnerable. And upwelling, when you upwell deep water, you upwell CO2-rich, fairly acidic water, but adding that now on top with the acidification caused by increasing concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. By the way, I don't know if I said this, but you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, it diffuses into the ocean. It doesn't just stay as carbon dioxide gas in the water, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid. That's the soda, the bite in your soda is carbonic acid that's been made by pushing CO2 into the drink. And this is with business as usual. If we don't get our act together and draw things down to zero for emissions, this is really important. This is like one of the, within decades, we won't have any more coral reefs. You're going to be, I tell this in my ocean class, you know, your kids, in a couple of decades, your kids are going to be whatever. Maybe if you wait 10 years to have kids, your kids will be 10 years old. And they're going to look at books with coral reefs, and they're going to say, Mommy, Daddy, why can't we go see these? And you're going to have to tell them, because we don't have coral reefs anymore. They're all dead. And that's 2 decades. Okay? Within decades, the polar seas will be so corrosive to calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate dissolves in acidic solutions. And coral reefs, the hard corals, are made out of calcium carbonate. So nothing, no planktonic organism that makes calcium carbonate will be able to live in the polar seas. A lot of these organisms are part of the base of the food web. And that's within decades. And then within decades, the upwelling, let's see, decades people rely on coastal ecosystem service. So people who do oyster farming, people who do fishing, anything, any kind of biological resource that you want to extract from the ocean is vulnerable now on the time scale of decades, not the end of the century, not your children's children, right now is the timeline. And it's expected to be kind of widespread, impacting food webs in a widespread way because we're impacting the base of the food web that expands out from there. Prospects for, doesn't that, how does that feel, guys? Do you think we should act? And again, I haven't even talked about food security and experiment or anything like that. Prospects for changing things. This is a happy sign, a hopeful sign. It's not the last step. The commitments that they made to reduce carbon dioxide emissions will still cause us to cross the 2-degree warming. We have to be better. Eventually, we have to go to zero. So we've taken a step to reduce, but we have a long. I think if we held on to the current commitments, we would reach something close to 2.7 to 3.2 degrees, something like that. Quite a ways over the 2-degree threshold that we don't want to cross. So we're not done with this. This meeting doesn't end everything, that's for sure. It's the first big step, but we have a lot more steps to take after that. Here's some 3 big points that came out of that meeting that I really hooked on to anyhow. And one is that reiteration of we can't cross 2. Every nation that was at that meeting, which is basically every nation on Earth, came out and said we should not cross 2 or we're in deep shit. Destabilize human civilization. So this is, guys, how many of you guys feel like this is science fiction or something? This is not, I promise. Preventing a 2-degree C warming will require that we take global emissions to zero. Everything we put in the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere. It's simple math, actually. We know at what concentration it will cross 2, and we know whatever we put there stays there. It doesn't go anywhere else, it stays there. So it's easy math. We have, at current rates, we have 2 decades worth of CO2 emissions, and if we don't do anything, at that point we cross. So the numbers are very clear. What we have to do is very clear. And the climate, the UN climate chief, she made this great comment when the NPR guy, she told the NPR guy, what we have to do is we have to take the global energy system to zero carbon emissions by mid-century. And he's like, and I've been saying that in my class for the last probably 3 years or so, because the numbers have really gotten clear. And he's like, are you kidding? What, and her response was classic. I mean, it's going to stay with me. It's one of those that I'm going to use over and over again in my class. She goes, well, unfortunately, the climate doesn't negotiate. And, it's true, we could be like, can't we have a little more time? No, no negotiation. So that's a great quote. So Anyway, and then finally, this aspiration of 1.5, and that's because island nations are going to be screwed with 2. 2 is going to sink island nations underwater. They were begging at Paris, they were begging for a 1.5 statement. And the best they could pull out was, we aspire to 1.5. So it's, anyway, so, almost nobody thinks we could actually accomplish that. We'd have to do this, Bob Power put the numbers out there, and 13 years, we'd have to take carbon emissions to 0 in 13 years if we want to stay to 1.5. We've got 20 years if we want to stay to 2. And again, I think 2 is not going to be fun, and it's certainly not going to be fun for island nations. What sort of effort? This is, more than 70 climate experts advise the UN framework on climate change that necessitates a radical transition, not minor tweaks and minor tunings. And this reminds me of this guy. I listened to this radio program in the evening, public radio, and he talked about climate change, and it just was like downer, 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 all the way along, like, geez. And somebody at the end raised their hand, and they said, like, how do you stay positive with all this? And he's like, I'm totally positive. And he said there have been 2 major revolutions in human history so far. There's been the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, and we were on the verge of a 3rd revolution as big, and I get to be alive to see it. I am so psyched. You guys are going to be alive to see something that very few generations have ever been able to see. One of these great changes in the way humanity is in the planet. So it was this thing coming up in the next few decades, with you being right in the middle of your careers, is as big as the agricultural revolution, as big as the industrial revolution. You could cry about it, but you could also, if you're smart, and this is what I tell people, look, if you're at Cornell, you see this clearly now, more than anybody else. You're in this room. If you set your careers up and you prepare yourself for that, you could be like, there's all sorts of opportunities here, because this revolution is going to be that big. And if you're set for it and you're aware that it's coming, you're prepared yourself for it. So it's not, there's some good things that you could get out of this big transformation that we're going to have to take. Okay. So what's the Cornell Climate Action Plan? A little bit of background. Okay, so now you have this idea, like what we're facing, guys, is, I know you're going to laugh at me, but I promise you, it's human civilization. It's a 10,000 year, what are we going to, do with ourselves kind of thing. So what is Cornell doing? Well, Scorton, I have to say, this is visionary, because back in 2007, I wasn't saying, we got to go to 0, we got to go to 0. I don't think I had that on my radar, but President Scorton did. And President Scorton, along with a couple of hundred other university presidents, signed what's called the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. And so Cornell became a charter signatory. And what it required is that each person who signed that commitment would bring together a climate action plan and a target date for reaching their campus, reaching net 0 emissions by whatever date they set. And Scorton set a 2050 date. He didn't just pull that number out of thin air. He had a lot of people, Vice President for Planning and Budget, Executive Vice President for Finance and Administration. So it wasn't just up here, we got to save the trees and all that. Like, there was some real thought here about the finances and what it would take and how much money it would take and how could Cornell do it and could we reasonably do it and all that. It wasn't just pulled out of thin air. So that was set in 2013. The Faculty Senate, recognizing as more data comes in, we're like, we don't have till 2050, man. We got till 2035. If we wait till 2050, we're going to blow through too. And so they came back with this resolution saying we need to accelerate this. We need to get the campus. We want to be a leader. We want to be in line with what we have to do, what the whole world has to do. We need to go to 2030. We need to go to 0 by 2035. All the other shared governance bodies, the Student Assembly and all these other groups, all came together and they all supported that resolution as well. So they did a year-long study, including a cost feasibility, the climate acceleration, the Climate Action Plan Acceleration Working Group. They came back with their plan, and President Scorton came out and said, after the plan, after this year-long review of both the science, the engineering and the cost, and said, today I again formally recognize the need for accelerated efforts to embrace the goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2035. So that's where Scorton leaves off. A little bit about the climate action plan, which I've got about 3 minutes to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to run over a little bit of time, but yeah, good. Okay, so anyway, deep geothermal. So we all know about lake source cooling, right? We take the cold water from the deep lake and we pump it up through the campus and we cool the buildings in the summer. Well, we want to drill like a couple of kilometers down in the earth where it's a lot warmer, 200 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and we want to circulate fluid just like the lake, but we want to circulate fluid, pick up heat in the deep earth, and then bring it back up and circulate it and warm the buildings during the winter time. It's going to cost $40 million, provide about 25% of our heating needs, and it's kind of a central nugget of our overall plan to take the campus to zero carbon emissions. And the overall, taking the whole campus, all the stuff, the lighting, everything, a $500 million price tag. And again, I'm not the budget guy, you know, but somebody on these committees and all these studies and all that did the numbers, and you know, they're scary numbers, no doubt about it. You know, I'm not in charge, but you know, one building on campus that you build, a new building's got to be at least $40 million. So this isn't, it's not like $40 million is astronomically too much money to help with any university possibly spend. This is like a building on campus. So, so the current administration, their hesitation, the president and the provost have both said, we kind of like the idea of deep geothermal. It's going to be this, it's kind of like the moonshot. They've even referred to it as like a moonshot. And they feel it would push boundaries and it would be a focus for research. So they're kind of, on the one hand, they kind of like that idea. On the other hand, again, these are my understandings, so I don't want to say like, this is the word of the, you know, that's how I understand it. My understanding is that they're hesitating because they're looking at the numbers and they're looking at Cornell's current financial situation, like, oh, I don't think we have enough money, you know, it's our we're fiduciary responsibility, hand-wringing, and blah, 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 blah. Again, it's easy for me to say that. I'm not the one that has to like make sure this university is around the next day and the next day. So that's part of your debate, I guess, tonight is, you know, is this little nugget right here, really. So counter-arguments, the stakes are way too high. I mean, this is like humanity, man. This isn't like, do we start a new kind of program or a new college or whatever. This is like, do we save humanity or not? So this idea about, oh, it's kind of expensive. It's like, you know, 10,000 years worth of people like, no, please spend the money. You know, it's like, God, you know, so it's a big deal, not a small deal. It's not like branching out into some new research area. This is saving humanity, essentially. Given the stakes, these guys just, I'm sorry, you know, but these guys just have to work harder, you know, and come up with more creative ways to find financing. They can get state, they can get federal, they can get whatever. Lots of people would benefit from understanding how deep geothermal works. So it's time to kick in gear, you know, and burn some midnight oil and come up with creative ways for funding this thing to get this thing done. You know, no is not an option. And if we want to be the green university of the world, as President Garrett stated, you can't be the green university and then not be the example of the green university and take the campus to zero too. You know, it's like you got to walk the talk. And we all know, you guys know this better than anybody else in this room. It's like, you know, if I give you, I mean, I have experience, so I know this for sure, 100%. It's like, if I gave you some loose deadline, you guys would never turn it in. Like, you'd never turn it in. It'd be like, I don't know, I'd never see it, you know. So giving you like, it's got to be in at this time, and like all the way to at 4 p.m., you know, I have to give you exactly the minute, actually. Because if I don't, it's like loose. And so setting a fixed date is like, it focuses your attention, and it focuses your determination to get it done. So I really think this fixed date, which this is what President Garrett doesn't want. She kind of wants to get to neutral. She just doesn't want to fix that date because it's just a scary thing to do, right, to fix that date. And so that's another point of argument. Should we fix this, or is this a big deal or not a big deal? I think it's a big deal to fix it. So I worried that I wouldn't quite convince you, so I'm pulling out the big guns here. And I'm going to play you a few videos, and then I have one last slide and I'm done. So here's my pulling out the big guns. So in this speech, replace carbon neutrality for space exploration, because this is the famous Kennedy speech, right? So here we go.
Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. William Branson, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
One last one.
United States, for we have given this program a high national priority, even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses, several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that of the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first, before this decade is out, then we must be bold. I'm the one who's doing all the work, so I'm just going to stay cool for a minute. However, I think we're going to do it. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school, at this college and university. It will be done during the terms of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done. And it will be done before the end of this decade. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America.
right, right. I mean, but I guess, this is the, all about politics and stuff. And I mean, that takes political courage, right? Because if the moon thing had not happened, then this guy wasn't assassinated. But, if it fell apart, he'd just be strung up and laughed out of office. And like, it's a pretty scary thing to do that kind of thing. And he didn't say, well, we should work towards it and kind of have that as an aspiration. He was like, we're doing this, and we're doing this by the end of the decade. And they did it. So it's a great example of what we have to do today. And last slide here. We've been born to a very special time. I told you that this is going to be a giant thing. It's going to be as big as the agricultural revolution and as big as the industrial revolution. And every so often, a generation gets called upon to rise up to greatness. And you guys are one of those generations. Back in 1940, you guys in this room, if this building was here, were called upon to fight a world war. And you guys are now being called upon to fight something even bigger, all of humanity, not just humanity for the next 10,000 years. So we can rise up and be great, or we can shrink back and be small. And I vote for being great, not small. And finally, as President Obama said, we are the first generation to fully understand the threat of climate change. And I promise, we are the last generation that has the chance to fix the problem. If we don't fix it now, we're going to cross too. It's been on us. This generation has been kicked down the road far too long. Each generation not wanting to face it, not wanting to face it. And we don't have any more time. And it's really a matter of now or never. Yes. Thank you.
No, it's totally fine. So we have time probably for 2 questions from the audience before we go ahead and begin our discussion. Are there any questions for Professor Monger?
Yeah, 1 and 2.
So one of the problems, I love climate change activism and stuff like that. One of the problems I've experienced with my friends and people who've taken your class even is that when you start listing the facts and how it's basically like we die or we do something else, they either adopt this like gung-ho attitude but then don't change anything in their daily lives, or they accept this defeatist attitude like, well, we're all going to die then, and it's just kind of like, had a conversation with someone and they're like, this is kind of bumming me out, can we stop talking about this? And it's like, so how do you have those difficult conversations and explain to our peers and our friends that without having this defeatist attitude?
Well, I mean, I have one idea that comes to my mind that I would like to sort of promote, which is, this idea, how nobody would be walking along the sidewalk and whatever they had in their hand, just throw it on the ground and keep walking. Everybody would be appalled by that, right? You'd be shocked to see that, right? And I think if you could get your head around this idea that carbon dioxide is as, this is one idea anyhow that I have, that if we could create this cultural thing where, I mean, I have to say, when I get behind somebody in a car and it's like a big Hummer, I'm not like, what a loud jerk. I'm like, what an asshole. He's putting all that CO2 into my atmosphere. I'm really pissed, And, somebody leaves the light on. It's not like you're a lazy person. It's like, you were leaving that light on and putting CO2 into my atmosphere. You're a jerk, So getting a sort of a social stigma to carbon dioxide, I think, might be one of those ways, but it's going to have to happen really fast, because we don't have any more time, man. Everybody that came before us was like, oh, you don't want to do it, it's too much, it's too scary, and now it's on us. And I'm hoping that, I mean, I have these ideas, and that, and I guess since this is political union, my great hope is that, because the science is so clear now that this sort of political resistance to each other fades away, and once the arguing stops and everybody faces we are all in this together. I mean, that was like World War II or 9/11. All of that Republican Democrat stuff faded away, and we all said, let's get our shit together and get stuff done. And I love watching these videos of World War II, the start of it, where we went from a Great Depression to battleships being pushed off one after the other into the ocean, and all these giant bombs. I mean, they're all to kill people, but if we did the same thing and put out wind turbines and solar panels, then if we get together and we stop arguing, once we get that, we can do amazing things. So we got to stop arguing. So
So I have a few different questions, but how similar is the 2035 plan to other plans at American universities?
Well, I mean, I don't know, so there's several hundred, lots of them, 100 and something have said by 2025 or 2030 or something like that, less than 2035. The California system is 2025. So there are lots of universities that made these commitments. We're not standing out as an oddball by any means at all. So.
And has there been any similar move by those administrations to go back on the?
I haven't heard of it, but I haven't heard that that's the case.
And then what do you say is like a counter to the argument that if the United States alone is dealing with addressing climate change and developing nations aren't doing their part in addressing climate change, that the U.S. efforts will really matter?
Well, but I mean, I would say U.S. has a position of leadership. We can make people feel pretty uncomfortable if they don't follow along. I think so. So I think if we take a leadership role, we have some high ground to sort of get after people who aren't doing that. So I think that's what I would say. Is I think there are ways, and people are all. I think people around the world. All those nations came out and said we're in deep shit. So I don't think anybody's going to try to is going to try to say no, we're not doing anything. I think everybody realizes that it's in their own self-interest as a nation to get this figured out. So I don't think it's going to be that way.
All right, great. So with the remaining time, we'll go ahead and have a discussion. We'll probably have this going on for around 10-15 minutes, and then we'll do a quick vote, and I'll hopefully get you guys out of here around 8:05. That's cool with everyone. So what we're going to go ahead and do is it's open to everyone. You can say your opinion regardless of what your opinion is. We're going to go ahead and just jot down a few things about your opinion just in case you want reference to it when we do the votes. And Professor Monger, if at any point you want to interject or add a comment or respond to some opinion, you're more than welcome to. So, once again, our question for tonight is, should Cornell University, I want to get the exact wording correct, should Cornell University make a strong commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by 2035? So we'll go ahead and open it up to the students. Opinions? Yes?
I wholeheartedly support the fact that we should achieve carbon neutrality. The one thing that I think could be an issue is that sometimes the solutions are very hard to articulate. I know Professor Monger did a good job with the DP, but there have to be multiple ways and multiple solutions that we can articulate and make it clear and have a definitive vision, not just saying, oh, everything's going to crap, like we only have one solution, but to have a distinct plan and have a clear plan and follow that plan thoroughly.
Definitely a concern. Not a lot of abstract ideas and maybe not so much specificity. Definitely a concern. Other opinions or responses to that? Yes?
Yeah, well, obviously Cornell should do the 2035 thing. I think that part of the problem here is that industrial corporations make fantastic profits off the exploitation of hydrocarbons. And industrial corporations control the university through the board of trustees. Half the board of trustees are on the board of directors of industrial corporations, the other half are on the board of directors of financial institutions that own industrial corporations. So those guys are trying to make a lot of money, and they're not gonna recognize that climate change is a real problem while they're doing that. I think that's really the root of this issue is the fact that our system of production is based upon not only the extraction of fossil fuels, but in burning them, as the professor said, is obviously really stupid. But we also use petroleum to produce plastic, which is something that we have everywhere. We're sitting in it right now. And a variety of other petrochemical products. And pollution is also is mounting. Climate change is only part of the problem. So, when we're thinking of these questions, yes, like carbon neutrality for a university is extremely important, but we need to think of the root cause of why climate change is happening in the first place, which is because capitalism is heavily reliant upon extraction of these resources from the ground. So, when we're thinking about solutions, and you made a very good point, as my previous person here is, we gotta think, well, what is a specific way that we can, start to implement a plan that's going to decrease emissions and pollution and fossil fuel extraction and land use, monoculture, as the professor mentions. And it's got to be preventing corporations from following the profit motive, which is unfortunately the basis of our current society. So it just doesn't seem to me that under the current economic system, any plan will really be effective so long as industrial corporations can make trillions off destroying the planet.
Thank you, that's a very interesting point.
I'll add a point.
Yes, please.
I think students have more power than they realize they have at a university. You know, you guys pay boatloads of money. I don't know what the breakdown is on endowment versus tuition, but if you guys like got together and said, you know, we're pissed and we're not happy about the way this thing is running, you guys, I mean, these guys work for you. You're paying them to teach you. And I think that if you guys raised your voices and said, we don't like the way you're running the show, I think there's power there more than you appreciate.
Definitely. Yes, please.
Building off of your point and the previous points.
Yes, and actually, if you want to go and say your name, just.
My name is Ayla.
Okay.
I think Professor Monger actually brought up something really important, and that is that the new technologies to produce like green energy would be really, really like economically good to invest in. Like obviously gonna take some time and money, but if we, for instance, or the board, people who are on the board of trustees are the ones who are leading the investment into green energy, then their payout is going to be much more than the dying breed of coal burning. So it's like that switch that can be brought out by our voices could, like, it would be easier to sway when we talk about what the investment would give to them and not what it would take away.
Does everyone agree that the Board of Trustees is at the root of this problem of why Cornell can't achieve neutrality by 2035? Or if there's a different point you want to add, please. Yes?
My name's Matt. I'm not sure if it's guaranteed that the Board of Trustees is the root problem, even though I agree that they're a big part of the problem. But I think one of the other issues that we have with using the argument that renewables are a good investment is that the people on the Board of Trustees, I haven't checked, but they're probably not 20. And when asked about millions of dollars and then retirement now, or millions of dollars for what that they won't be around for later, I mean, it's maybe a little bit cynical, but I think that they just don't care. So I'm not sure that that argument would work. If the number one priority is money, they might as well make their millions now and then go to the beach.
That's a great point. So then that raises another question, is how do you get people, if this is the problem, how do you get them to care? Any responses to that or other points, questions? Yes?
Well, yeah, I think I agree with that. Like, I'm totally supportive of the 2035 plan, but my concern would just be like, especially in regards to Cornell implementing the underground heating and everything that was said in the presentation, would be where are we getting this money from? Are we going to raise our students' tuition? And in addition to that, I think it would be, I definitely support Cornell implementing it because I think we're like a known institution, so we should do that, but we're just one institution, so it's like, what is everyone else around us going to do? And like, we can be a role model, but if nobody else really cares, then what is one school's impact going to be?
That's a great point. Without collective action, is there really an impact? Or maybe as President Kennedy said, you know, you have to have the leader that then influences others to come along. Yes?
Yeah, I think there's really this point that I think the university would be very quick to offload the cost to students, and that we've seen that happen in like many different cases. So that's always a possibility. And I also would say though that as far as like what are our surroundings like and what are people around us doing, I think though what's going to be very beneficial to us is that I think Cornell has a lot of sway in like just New York communities at large, especially because of the agricultural history that we have and like the agricultural history in New York in general. So we have a lot of resources through like lots of different means all over the state of New York, and a big population of people in New York are like people in the agricultural industry who could be easily incentivized to like become more energy sustainable.
Definitely a good point. Cornell University does have a lot of networks and connections that we could definitely build off of. But of course, as you mentioned, it could also come at the cost of students with higher tuition fees. Other questions, points? We still have some time for a few more. Yes.
I'm just curious if it's gonna be this, I don't know, difficult to get this change implemented in Cornell, which at least to me seems like an easier place to make this sort of reform. What's the outlook for the rest of the country, the rest of the world? I mean, to me, it seems kind of dismal.
True, it's very blue, I mean, when you consider it, so, of course, that brings up the question that you were asked before, it's, you know, is it worth it, that case was so.
I mean, I'm not trying to doubt whether or not it's worth it, by asking that. I am just, it's sort of a direct question, honestly, to you,
Well, I'm an optimist, so I'll die an optimist, I think, but, I don't know, I have this sense that, you know, again, I really don't like bringing up like Republican, Democrat stuff and all that, you know, I never do it in my ocean class or as much as I can, but I think we all know, if we're in this political unit thing, you know, like there's a lot of resistance from the Republican side, and there's this, you know, the way politics works, you know, they have to like create some sort of mystique about, you know, like who, you know, like they have to create an image. I don't know how to describe it, but you know, the Republicans have decided to sort of take on this image of, you know, denial and all that kind of stuff, and they kind of built a sort of a brand around that sort of thing to sell, but I see shifts in that, you know, like the wording that I see these guys use aren't so much, you know, it went from it's not happening to, well, I'm not a scientist, and now it's like, well, maybe it won't be as bad as they all say it's going to be, or, you know, maybe we have more time than we think we have. So there's this, they're starting to kind of, I think, fall apart, and my great hope, being the optimist, is like, in 2 or 3 years, because sometimes these guys are standing there, you know, saying it's all made up, and like everything's on fire behind them, you know, and at some point it's going to look really silly, and that's when I hope that we all come together, you know, we all like go, okay, and we drop this battle, and once we come together, amazing things happen. So anyway, I'm an optimist. 3 years, it's going to happen.
Before we go ahead and vote, we have time for probably 2 more comments. Who has not gotten a chance to speak? Yes?
So, I feel like with respect to the question about what other people are doing in other countries or other universities, I feel that we have the resources and technology to probably find, you know, a way to probably get more grants, and like money-wise, if we're local, and if we ask the government for grants, if we ask companies to help us out, we could probably find a lot of money that way. And I feel like it's really worth the effort to try, because later on, like, you don't want to be the one person who didn't do anything because they thought that other people weren't going to do anything for it. They felt that it wouldn't be worth that. Like, being the only one is that rises above the spotlight. Only one of us.
Sure. Maybe we should be held to a higher standard. Who would like the final word before we go ahead and vote? And also, you've all been passed the vote sheets. It has agree, disagree, and abstain. That is to the position of Professor Monger that presented today, whether you agree or disagree with it. And once you finish, just hold it up in the air. One of our helpers will go ahead and pick it up. Final word. Who would like it? Yes, go ahead.
So I think one last point to make is contrasting this neutrality plan with the Cornell Tech enterprise that's going to be happening in New York City. If we're able to spend a ton of money and use a lot of resources to build this campus on Roosevelt Island, it's kind of hard to reconcile that with the fact that we're not able to, or we're hesitant to achieve this plan of carbon neutrality by 2035. If we're using similar amounts of money and similar amounts of resources, we should focus on the green university instead of just all about Cornell Tech.
All right, thank you. We're going to go ahead and finish collecting the ballots, and then after that we'll count them, and we'll go ahead and announce the final decision. In the meantime, while they're counting it, just a few announcements. First off, one final round of applause to our great speakers. Also, going forward, we will be meeting Tuesdays in Mount 228. Thank you everyone for the slight change in our regular schedule. This Thursday, February 25th, we'll be co-sponsoring an event with the U.S. Political Interest Research Group, they're known as U.S. PIRG, from 10 to 12 a.m. p.m. They'll have a table set up at Hope Plaza, and they'll be doing a photo petition to call on KFC to stop serving meat raised with antibiotics. From what I understand, they're trying to fight against giving